Good morning. I'm here to help you discuss some of the main points in Chapter 14, starting with the very beginning. Okay, so in Chapter 13 we took a look at the political, economic, cultural, military consequences and causes of the expansion westward. Now, the bigger issue and the subtext of that becomes the question of whether or not America should expand slavery into the territories. Now, your book begins with a brief overview of some of the history behind the expansion of slavery. We do know that in the Constitutional Convention in 1787, that although issues concerning the slave trade were resolved somewhat in a concessional way to the South, the main issue of slavery in the territories was postponed until, of course, 1820, and the Missouri Compromise came along when Henry Clay began to suggest that there might be a way to appease both the northern states and the southern states, specifically with regards to the economic issue of slavery and the benefits of cotton exports to the American economy, as well as to a growing sense of abolitionists in the North who were beginning to sense that slavery in itself was unjust and must be ended. The idea was to take the newly defined Louisiana Territory and divide it up amongst the 3630 parallel, and to say that everything north of the bottom of that line in Missouri would be free, with the exception of Missouri, and everything south would be considered slave. Although, of course, in 1820, we did not have the Western territories past the Rockies. We do know that in 1833, the nullification crisis had provoked South Carolina to the point where their issue in defense of states' rights made the expansion of slavery not just an issue concerning economics or concerning the balance of representation, but the constitutional issue of whether or not states had the authority to define whether or not they would obey all of the boundaries of federal laws. And in order to kind of like shut down abolitionist dissent, specifically with amendments to existing bills that had nothing to do with the expansion of slavery, the South and their constituents in the North helped pass the gag rule in 1836, okay, which meant that you could add addendums to bills, but you couldn't say anything about the issue of slavery. And now we come to the issue of the presidency of Andrew Jackson and the definition between the northern and southern constituencies of the Whig and Democratic Party. Now remember, the Whig Party is a party that stood up in opposition to Andrew Jackson. Specifically, many of his particularly divisive stands on the removal of Native Americans, the destruction of the American Bank, and the question of nullification. Many Whigs just thought that the way that Andrew Jackson was interpreting the office of the presidency was incorrect. Now this becomes a problem for them in essence because the Whig Party becomes more of a kind of an opposition party to an existing not just a system, but an existing chief executive. It's harder to define what the Whigs actually stand for. Northern Whigs end up having their sympathies with abolitionists. Southern Whigs end up supporting many of the states' rights and nullification issues. And this is also true of the Democrats. So even though Andrew Jackson was a strong executive, James Polk was the same, we begin to see that the Democrats begin this regional disruption between, supporting the issue of the expansion of slavery here. And that brings us to the late 1840s. Now, in the outbreak of the Mexican War, a small, little-known congressman from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot introduces the idea that all of the territory that would be acquired from Mexico would not include slaves. Now, this was, a non-starter. It was dead in the water when it began. However, what happened was, and your book points this out, that now Congress was beginning to understand two separate issues. One was this idea of free soil, and the idea that the expansion of territory need not include the expansion of slavery. And the second was this idea that there were constitutional issues involved in here as well. In this sense, the issue is not really just whether or not slavery should be expanded into the territory, but whether or not the Constitution defines the rights of states when they apply for statehood to determine whether or not they be slave or free. Now, as you can probably expect, John C. Calhoun directly opposes this. However, he fails to actually get the support that he needs in order to, build a strong coalition. The basic essence of the Wilmot Proviso, though, is that the Whigs and the Democrats themselves do not want to take on this issue, not without some kind of larger compromise. And in essence, we see that southern states begin to look towards Central America and the Caribbean in order to expand their slave territory, assuming that they may find that the western expansion doesn't include them. But we also see here that as one congressman calls it, it is treason to the Constitution. It's interesting that the Wilmot Proviso provokes this outstanding response because, of course, the Constitution sidestepped the issue of slavery's existence at all by vaguely banning the trade of slaves into the United States, which implicitly states that something about the importation of slaves is wrong. However, it also includes provisions for slavery representation and a weak but not enforced fugitive slave law in the original Constitution itself. So, by the election of 1848, we begin to see that there is, this growing division over what do you do with the territory. So, James Polk's Secretary of State suggests expanding the Missouri Compromise to the Pacific Ocean. James Buchanan, Virginian, later Pennsylvanian, born in Virginia, represents this idea that many began to see that instead of doing what they considered to be morally right in terms of their conscience, they decided to try and simply avoid the thorny question about the morality of slavery, as your book states. The other position is taken by a Michigan senator named Lewis Cass, who proposes the idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty, of course, as I've mentioned in class, washes the hands of those in the Senate and the House, as well as the President, and allows not colonial, but territorial legislatures to make up their minds for themselves. As your book states, he prefers to leave such questions ambiguous. Now, the political benefit for leaving these questions ambiguous means that the Whig and Democratic parties, which had constituencies in the North and South, might coalesce and fall together in supporting one candidate rather than splitting themselves amongst northern and southern lines in order to become divisive. And so Cass ends up being nominated by the Democrats for the presidency in 1848. The Whigs, they reject Henry Clay, perpetual loser of presidential elections, unfortunately. Sorry to all of the descendants of Henry Clay. But they nominate a war hero instead, Zachary Taylor. Now, Zachary Taylor in itself is this person who claims that, he is a man above political division, and he is a general. So he'll come in, he'll do the right thing, he'll take over as the chief executive, and he was a popular war hero because he slaughtered a lot of Mexicans. Now, taking aside the issue that many disagreed with the war in Mexico in the first place, this becomes a larger question about whether or not, a general like Zachary Taylor would be a person that represented the best interests of the United States. Southerners thought Taylor might support them in slaveholding. This is true of Andrew Jackson, who was also a general who supported the issue of slaveholding. And Northerners were pleased that he took no stand on the Wilmot Proviso, which, of course, was the intent of Lewis Cass when he left those issues ambiguous. But, as we'll see, taking no stand on an issue can be not a sign of strength, but an incredible sign of weakness, especially for those who seek the chief executive and are playing to the issue of just getting elected rather than taking a moral or ethical position. So what happens is Calhoun tries, as I stated earlier, to get people to rally behind this issue of a new unified Southern party. It doesn't actually work at this point, which is interesting because Calhoun's South Carolina exposition in the early 1830s does rally many of the Southern states around the issue of states' rights. So the real question is, if he could rally the South in order to support the issue of nullification, why couldn't he rally the South as one major political party, a Southern political party, which included Southern Whigs and included Southern Democrats? Well, part of that lies in the uncertainty after the Mexican War of what to do with this territory, and the other issue really is one that involves, a larger understanding of the context of Congress, which is that if the South created an entire coalition, they would be responsible, okay, for the decisions that followed. In other words, they couldn't use the regional differences as a defense against their arguments. They would themselves be the driving force behind executive and legislative change. Now, this division, the division of the Missouri Compromise, the division of Northern and Southern Democrats and Northern and Southern Whigs, becomes kind of a beneficial issue in, helping some politicians just say that what they're doing is trying to preserve the Union rather than stand for one issue or another. And this becomes true in Daniel Webster's case when, as we'll see, Daniel Webster ends up supporting the Compromise of 1850, and the Northerners like burn him in effigy and throw him out of office, and well, his health fails, and we'll see after the Compromise of 1850 that Clay, Webster, and Calhoun, who rose as these brilliant young oratorical stars of the War of 1812 in the Senate, and who usher in this Civil War or antebellum period, end up all failing not only to preserve the Union, but also failing in their health and dying. Okay, right before the Civil War starts. So what happens is Taylor wins. Oh, but there's a problem. Even though there is some of the conscious Whigs who support Van Buren for the presidency, they do not encourage the support of the majority of the electorate. And so just like John C. Calhoun, the conscious Whigs also end up failing because this division in political parties by region ends up serving both. So here's where we are right now in the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise is a thorny issue. It's one that Clay offers as an omnibus bill in order to try and resolve the problems. Okay, the problems themselves are the result of the Mexican War and this issue of what to do with the expansion of slavery. And so we see this come up in the 7 different proposals of the Compromise of 1850. And I just wanted to show you this in the terms of let's make this a little bit bigger, in the terms of what later becomes the Fugitive Slave Act. This is a document in your primary sources section of the My History Lab page. Okay, so if you click on the Fugitive Slave Act, you'll see that these 7 provisions were there. So what does the Fugitive Slave Act propose? Well, it says let's bring in California as a free state. Okay. By admitting California as a state, the majority of the people there did not expand or want the expansion of slavery. They realized that it would propose vast differences for the country as a whole. I am running a little bit short on time for my 15-minute segment, so even though I've spoken very quickly and I've tried to include a lot of information, I am going to pick up the topics of the Compromise of 1850 in my next section. Okay? Sayonara!